So I guess from late submissions, any other issues with assignment or more or less clear? Yeah. I guess it was more sort of a somehow design exercise, designing a questionnaire. So did you choose, didn't have a look, did you choose a topic related to your thesis, or did you?
Yeah. I chose a previous topic I worked on.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. So again, if you have any specific questions, just feel free to ask. So today is going to be our last lecture, and from next week we're going to work on the 3 big project. Exciting. So for the last lecture, we're going to talk about interviews and focus groups. Again, that's a topic or a technique you're most likely going to use at some stage. We probably will scratch a little bit sort of the analysis of these more qualitative approaches, but we can't go into too much detail there. So we'll talk more about how to conduct interviews and focus groups, what are the pros and cons of interviews and focus groups, and but not in that much detail about analyzing the data. There's an introductory chapter in the book that you can have a look, and sort of there's also suggested for further literature and reading to get a good idea on how to analyze this type of data in detail. So, well, with an interview, the main idea is to ask a user or a study participant questions. So it's sort of a direct conversation, and those conversations can be more or less structured, and that's something we want to talk about, sort of what are possible structures of those interviews, especially interviews in focus groups. So the main idea for you is to get some information and understanding about needs, problems, requirements, and those types of things. So they're, to some extent, well, certainly different from questionnaires, because you just get different quality of information out of interviews rather than questionnaires or other evaluation and testing approaches. So again, as we sort of discussed in the beginning, there's no one best way of getting your data. All those evaluation approaches are tools in your tool bag, I guess. And then in the end, it's for you to decide which one's the most appropriate tool to get an answer to your questions. So if you have a hammer, it's good for hitting a nail, but not so good for to drive in a screw. So it really depends on what the task at hand is and what your questions are. From that, you're going to decide which is the most appropriate evaluation tool to get an answer to. And so today we're talking about what types of questions are sort of suitable for choosing interview or focus groups. And so the main difference apparently between interviews and focus groups is the number of participants you have at the same time. So with interviews you do one at a time, one person at a time, and with focus groups that's more than one people at a time.
Sorry, focus groups is the same technique that marketing people use to evaluate TV programs, and
it's similar. Yes, sort of it's the same setup. You have multiple people gathered around the table to discuss about certain topics. Yeah. So just some high-level pros and cons of this type of approach. So interviews and focus groups are very good to go into more depth about a certain question. If you compare it to questionnaires, for example, questionnaire give you some idea and most of this numbers. How many people like your new interaction technique. With interviews and focus groups, you can better go into depth, sort of not just how many, but why is it they enjoy interacting with your new technique. Just get a better idea how they do this interaction as well. So again, sort of they're better to go into depth and get sort of an understanding about the why and how. Well, about the how, you also can do observations, which is probably better for the how, but just to get an idea about sort of perceptions and sort of why something takes place, why something is enjoyable, what sort of interviews are quite good. And they can be rather flexible and more flexible than questions. On the downside, they require more skill from the experimenter to manage, because there are certain dynamics during an interview, and focus groups especially, that have to be handled. So really also depends on the structure of your interview. For example, the more unstructured the interview is, the more difficult it can be to manage the interview, to really get quality data out of it, and to keep sort of the conversation on track, as you can appreciate probably. It takes time. It takes more time normally than other research approaches like questionnaires or an efficiency study. It certainly takes more time to perform an interview, and especially to analyze the data. So analyzing the data, we talk a little bit about that, can be quite time intense for those types of data. And you're always dealing with potential recall problems, because you ask a person about their perception. So how did you enjoy, how did you like using, or just interacting with a robot, for example? How did you like that? You're asking to recall the previous interaction, and there's always potential of bias. People who start to rationalize, and all kinds of different problems can arise. So ideally, what you look into is what's called triangulation. We scratched the topic earlier as well. So the idea with triangulation is to combine different methods of gathering and getting data from your participants. So it could be you combine the interview with direct observation. You combine an interview with more structured time measurements, error measurements, for example. So a combination of data sources always gives you more probably confidence in your results, and just different angles, different viewpoints. So you get different types of insights from different approaches. And so it's always a good idea, if you can manage and have the time and the resources to do it, to combine different evaluation approaches, because you just get different types of data out of it, and different types of information. So in which phases or for which types of research are interviews used most of the time? So they're very good in initial and early stages of your research, for sort of initial phases, to basically gather information quite early on, just to get a better understanding of a topic area, for example. So if you're not really clear about a topic area, or sort of not yet there that you can form a really coherent or strong hypothesis about a study outcome, it might be a good idea to conduct some interviews to get a better grasp on the topic area and better understanding of sort of the research topic, and sort of to see where are actually questions, open questions that have to be answered. So in early stages, interviews can be quite beneficial to find to get a better understanding, basically find potential questions for that grant further research. They can be good for requirement analysis. So if for your usability study, you probably did a requirement analysis. So interviews can be quite beneficial in those stages, to get a grasp on, okay, what is it actually the users want? What is it they need? What are the requirements for a photo board? What do the users Oh, interesting. Doesn't affect us, does it? But it was a brilliant error message, wasn't it? A socket, whatever. I don't know what it wanted to tell me. I think we had the topic last time, didn't we? Oh, it's just about error messages. Oh, okay, yeah, probably, yeah. But it didn't tell me so, did it? Great. And so it can be part of a whole sort of evaluation, as we said, procedure, and focused more on gathering just subjective reactions and perceptions of your participants. Who do you interview? If we talk about, for example, again, requirement analysis. Again, the photo board example that you did. You can interview potential end users, so you can interview people who are going to use the photo board. So what do you expect the functionality to be? If you come in, how would you want to sign in, sign out? What types of information would you want to get from this type of application or this photo board? But it can be other people as well. It can be stakeholders. So if you do requirement analysis with Christoph, he's going to be an end user probably, but as well has another role there as well. As a supervisor, as a manager to some extent. So that he has just other roles. So you can be quite flexible with whom you're going to interview, and because again you will get different input, different information from different people. So it's not just the actual end users you're interested necessarily here, but you can be a little bit more flexible with getting other people as well.
I was thinking in the difficulties that you have working with children, especially these children that they are not enough older to structure some a coherent conversation. Toddlers, I don't know what's the name in English.
Toddlers.
Yeah. This kind of children that they start to talk, but they don't have a complete perception of the world. It is possible to apply this technique with this kind of.
It's certainly that's actually a very good example with children. So we did several studies with children. It's not just toddlers. Even children aged, let's say 7, 8 years old. If you go to school and try to interview children, let's say 8-year-old child, it's very difficult to get valuable data out of them because you're coming there as this strange person. You're an adult. You come there, they don't know you. They don't trust you. So it's very difficult actually to get information out of them in the first place. So that's what I found quite often. You ask them. We did a study, for example, using an augmented reality book with 7, 8-year-olds. Afterwards, you ask them, so what can you remember? Can you try to retell the story? What can you remember from the story? And some children, some were quite open and just started, talking, and some just sat there looking at me, and not that they didn't remember stuff from the story, but they just were scared, and they just didn't want to tell me. Either they didn't want to, they couldn't, they were scared. So there's all those different things. They didn't trust me. They probably parents told them, don't talk to strangers. But that's so there's all kinds of different issues that can come up there. And here it might be a good idea, to include in your interviews or in your evaluation approach teachers and parents as well to get some information that's valuable for you.
And it is possible, for example, in this particular example that you are giving us, that you can say to their teacher, "Oh, please, could you ask them?"
Sure, definitely.
And of course, the reaction is different from the children, right? Because they trust in the teacher and they are more open with the.
So using proxies it's certainly a good way. It sort of also reminds me of an example. So at a conference, there was a presentation, or I think it was a keynote presentation, of a person who does research in Africa about sort of cell phone usage. You know, so what's the sort of technology usage in Africa and Kenya and sort of least developed countries. So they do quite a lot of research with, well, for example, villages. You know, African. You know, they do use cell phones to some extent, and so those researchers are quite interested in sort of how they use it and what sort of what would be needed for them to accept technology and all those kinds of different research topics. So, and he, for example, found as well that as a researcher, you know, if you go there to those villages and try to do some ethnography studies or whatever, you know, it's there's a huge issue of acceptance and sort of trust, and so he says, like, you know, it's very difficult to actually get any information out of them at all, or to even accept you into the village in the first place. So they are using sort of like key informants. So they don't do the research themselves, but they have like proxy people who are well, who know
inside of the community.
They're inside of the community. They know the people. They have a good appreciation for the technology, and sort of they are the link between the researcher and the end user in the end. So for those types of things, well, that's sort of quite, you know, far away. So you most likely won't do your master's topic in, you know, cultural acceptance of mobile phones in Africa. But, you know, that's one example. And the other example, quite a lot closer, is, for example, children, or even other types of communities. You know, could be even elderly if you go, and different types of users and communities, you know, can be quite difficult to approach directly, and so they can be important to include more people within your like other stakeholders within your evaluation approach, or even use key informants for getting some type of information.
In the case of, I guess in this topic there are many particular issues depending of the population that you are researching. But what kind of problems could you find in elderly populations to apply these techniques? I mean, you talked before about the children problems that you can have when you're working using interviews. But what happened with the elderly people?
Well, I guess, you know, I'm not an expert with elderly, but, you know, I just, for example, you know, I mean, just the other day, I visited my neighbor, and he's an elder person, and I guess sort of one issue is trying to keep the conversation on track and not somehow, you know, I don't know if you have sort of experienced that as well, but, you know, some people try to digress and try to tell you the life story, I guess, you know, because they quite like to, well, talk with you, you know, about different topics. So all kinds of different issues, I guess, you know, they come up and that are important for this person. And so I guess you have to strike a balance between, you know, trying to keep the conversation on track and still, you know, to manage a good relationship with your participant, and to still allow some type of digression. Because I guess, you know, if you just only strictly keep to the topic, I don't know, you might not, you know, develop sort of a good sort of conversational relationship with the person. So, and it can be probably quite challenging to manage, basically getting your topic information and manage this with conversational information, and, you know, and just keeping the whole dynamics on in track. So.
Yeah, because I was thinking some example with elder people in Japan. They were testing robots with elderly population in some kind of retirement house, and I guess one issue in this, especially with this robot, it was that they suggest the power of the suggestion from the researcher to the participants. You know, he I guess in the translation he didn't say, do you like the robot? He didn't do questions. He suggests, do you like the robot? You like the robot, and the elderly people say, yeah.
Well, but this is a problem not just with elderly. This is a general problem. So it's a problem of the researcher. To how do you phrase your questions? How do you how do you gather this your information? And being suggestive, that's always a potential issue. Because ideally, certainly, because I think it's not just the elderly, but again, children. If you ask a child, how do you like it? He said, oh yeah, I like it. So what do you think of it? Yeah, sure, yeah, I like it. So is it sort of really a reflection of what did they really like it, or do they just try to please you? So it's certainly, on the one hand, you in asking the question, you want to be as neutral as possible, not suggest, because then there's not just a chance of bias, but it's a very high chance of biased response.
But it's hard because your body language, for example, if you are expecting good results about this research, and you start to asking, and you are so enthusiastic, you transmit this.
But that's what I just mentioned earlier. It needs skill to manage sort of interviews well, and so it's something you have to practice, and you have to practice how you come across as well. So it's certainly very important how you pose the question and how you behave in general towards the person.
Maybe we need robot interviewers, to avoid it.
Yeah, might be an option, but then again, some people might have some reservations talking to the robot rather than the real person. So I think there's no ideal way of doing it. Let's talk about different structures of interviews and different types of interviews. So interviews can be fully structured, semi-structured, or unstructured. And so the less structure you have, the more flexibility you apparently have in conducting the interview and getting information out there, and you potentially get more in-depth insight into a topic area. But it also becomes more difficult to manage and to conduct the interview. For example, if it's about posing questions, if you have a fully structured interview with the questions spelled out, then you just sort of have to read the questions, and so there's less potential of you posing the question suggestively. Well, given you did a good job in writing down the questions neutrally. But if you don't have a lot of structure and you have to come up with a question on the fly, you have to have sort of skill in on the fly posing the question correctly. There's more chance of slipping or just formulating questions incorrect, or non-ideal if you do this just on the fly, non-structured. So fully structured basically means this is sort of a orally presented survey. So you have all the questions spelled out, and you read the questions out to the person. Because it's structured, you have to basically to stick with a script. And the pros are, they're similar to questionnaires, so they're good for comparing different differences between individuals, because you have, again, same questions for every person. And for some people, it can be easier to compare to a question. It can just be easier to talk about an issue rather than having to write a lengthy essay about sort of what they think about your new technique, or in general your sort of new robot interface. For a fully structured interview, the downside is that it's actually not foresee that you ask follow-up questions. If you want to do follow-up questions, you want to use something like a semi-structured interview. This is a mixture between having a guideline for questions, having some questions written out, but you still allow some digression from your structure. So the question can sort of just serve as a starting point for discussion. And you certainly can ask follow-up questions if it's suitable and necessary. But you sort of still have a certain script that you want to more or less follow through. But because it's semi-structured, you can sort of digress from the script. You can ask follow-up questions or ask other questions then as well. And unstructured interview is basically, as well as the title says, it's just unstructured. So you get, you more explore the topic area freely with your interviewee. You can pose an initial question and try to sort of start a discussion like that. But it can be, well, it can be good on the one hand to get a better viewpoint from the person, because you don't basically try to fit your structure to the person. It's like, okay, please answer this question and answer that question, but you more try to get a good idea, an open idea from the person to some extent. But on the other hand, the downside is they certainly need a lot more. There's a lot more involving in terms of sort of experiments of skill. So you have to formulate question. You have to keep track of what has been talked about. So you have to pose questions that are important. It's more difficult probably to sort of have the metacognitive skills about sort of, okay, how do I formulate the question neutrally, for example. They're certainly more difficult to analyze then as well. Because you have to do more content analysis, so you have to go through first probably transcribe what has been sort of discussed. So you have to have a transcription, and then you have to categorize the themes and topics that emerge from the interview. We're going to talk a little bit about content analysis in the end, but again, we can't talk about this in too much detail. But it's certainly going to be more difficult and time-consuming to conduct those interviews and analyze the data you get out of them. So another option that you can look into, sort of, if you can ask questions. Well, so obviously it's an interview, so you can ask questions, but you also could incorporate some like demo or into sort of the interview. So you could ask, if you have a new prototype, for example, you can combine interview with a demonstration of your technology, prototype, whatever. You can show artifacts in general, like paper prototypes, sketches, photographs, to elicit basically, well, either to start discussion or to elicit to certain, answers, for example. You can see how, participants react to probes. Probes are sort of like prototypes or props that are designed to elicit sort of certain reactions. So you can be, to some extent, quite creative, how you want to conduct those interviews then as well. And if if it's suitable, then introduce an artifact into your interview to start a discussion or to discuss about how they are going to be used, or even to include some observations into your protocol. So yeah, let's talk about some questions. So we talked about types of questions last time as well. This is very similar, basically, to some extent to what we talked about last time, but probably a little more specific towards interviews. So you get closed-end questions. Closed-end questions, there is a specific answer expected to them, like yes/no questions. It's closed-ended because there's only sort of those yes/no answers. So did you like the homepage? Yes or no? Or basically, please rate on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 to 7, how you like the web design, the web page design, or whatever. Similar to the questionnaires, they're quite easy to analyze because you basically can transcribe them to yes/no or to numbers, then you can easily analyze them and even run some statistics on them. But if you have, for example, did you like the web page? Yes, no, and then ask, okay, why did you like it? That's then more an open-ended question, because you want to elicit an open answer to this question. So why did you like it? What did you think about doing this? How do you think this could be used in the future? Or how do you believe people will interact with robots in the future? So those types of questions are what you want to elicit an open, more elaborate answer. Can be more informative, apparently, than, well, most likely more informative than the closed-ended questions, but can be more involved in terms of data analysis then as well. Because you will get a different answer from different people. So you have to, if you want to compare those answers, you again have to make sense of what has been talked about. You have to categorize, you have to make sense of that, and you have to interpret the data accordingly. And this, to some extent, is similar to, again, the questionnaires, what we talked about, how to, if you formulate questions for questionnaires, and for interviews, you want to have your questions as simple as possible, and as easy to understand as possible, not confusing, not ambiguous, ideally. So it should be clear what you're asking to the person that they are able to give you a clear answer to your question. Try to avoid jargon, abbreviations, those type of things. Also, avoid compound questions, so try to ask about one concept at a time, and not multiple concepts. Avoid judgmental phrases or suggestive phrases, for example. Well, do you think this is hard to use? You're already putting some words into sort of the interviewee's mouth, I guess. Do you think it's hard to use? This is our newest development. So blah blah blah. Well, sort of open-ended or sort of follow-up questions. So sometimes or in open and unstructured interviews can be either sort of follow-up questions. Well, did you like my new interface? It's like, oh, yes or no. Why would be a follow-up question. That's an easy one. But you could elaborate more on that. Just throughout the discussion, it can come up that you're really interested. Okay, they talked about potential future users. So then you could like, okay, so you mentioned future users. So how would you, for example, imagine this could be used in future interfaces? And so you can do this sort of generate basically new types of questions based on what has been talked about. But again, this needs some skill from yourself, because you have to keep track basically of what has been talked about. Has been certain things, have they been covered already or not? How do you formulate the question to make sense and not to be to run into pitfalls that we have talked about earlier? So it can be to some extent challenging.
I can guess that the successful results of this kind of method depends totally of the level of experience of the researcher, mm-hmm. right? Because a younger researcher with not so many experience can create easily tendencies or a bias or most experienced person, of course, would be.
Yeah, definitely. So it needs some practice and skill to manage it quickly. That's sort of, I guess, why sort of the second bullet point. It's easier in the first to start off with more structured interviews. Because it's just easy to manage, easy to conduct those interviews. So it's a good idea not to be too ambitious in the first place. Like, okay, I just want to get right into just get all the type of information out of there with a fully unstructured interview. So it's easier, I guess, in the beginning to have more structure that you can rely on, that you can that it's just easier for you to manage sort of those interviews in those situations. And once you're more comfortable with those situations and with sort of with the interview situations, you know, it's safer then, you know, to start off with sort of more, or just to begin more unstructured interviews. Then once you have sort of good idea and appreciation how those interviews normally work. Again, similar to other tests you do, like all the evaluations you do, it's always a good idea to do your homework first. You know, pilot test your approach. You know, as you would do for other types of evaluations, for questionnaires, for your studies, pilot test your approach with colleagues, with potential end users you want to interview. So just to make sure that that the wording is correct, that sort of the length, for example, is sort of within manageable. Sort of what that you don't go sort of for too long, for example. So pilot testing is always very, very good idea. Well, sort of those interview guide for yourself. You know, it's if you have sort of a structured interview, it's probably less need for sort of a guide. But if you do unstructured interviews, you know, it's still good to probably have sort of a guideline for yourself. You know, to sort of have an idea what okay, this is still necessary, this is still, you know, would be important to cover, to do. So even if you have sort of a unstructured or semi-structured interview, you know, still have some sort of a guideline for yourself, you know, to see, well, if it's for example important topics you want to talk about, that you still sort of have a reminder to don't include those things into your protocol. Backups are always important. So most of the time what you probably want to do with interviews, you want to record, well, somehow you want to record the answers anyway. So either written, audio, or video. However you decide to record the data, just make sure you have backups. Because, you know, batteries run flat, you run out of paper, even your pen could just run out of ink, whatever, you know, just could break. Just always be sure to have a backup plan. Because again, you know, you don't want to run an interview for half an hour, then potentially lose all the data. Because then you wasted not just your time, but participants' time as well. So notes, as we said, you know, there's somehow you have to make notes to sort of gather the data you want. You know, mental notes can be quite challenging. So if you want to keep track of everything just by remembering it, that can be quite challenging. So you want to think about other ways of documenting the data. Can be paper notes. Even if you decide to do other recordings like audio or video, still it's a good idea to have a notepad with you, to make other types of notes that you probably wouldn't, or just like, he talked about this, just make a note, make follow-up questions afterwards, or it just blinked with his eye, whatever, when I asked that question. I don't know. All those types of additional types of information and observations can be very important for your data analysis afterwards, which you probably wouldn't see in a video or in an audio recording. So always a good idea to have a notepad with you to scribble down certain things, scribble down observations, or just try to keep track, or just indexing, for example. And you say like, at time, at 20 minutes, they were to really talk about something interesting, so that you can fast forward afterwards in your recording, video recording, whatever, to this time, and have another look or listen to what has been done exactly at this time. So it's always a good idea to have additional paper notes.
How can affect if you have a third person in the process? I mean, you you could be interviewer, you have a participant, and somebody else is taking notes about the conversation.
That's certain.
Affects,
Well, normally, well, probably depends on the situation, but generally, I guess depends on how obvious it is. But normally, people try to forget about additional, even for video, normally people tend to forget that there's a video camera running. For me, for example, now, when I see the video camera, it's obvious that I'm recorded. But otherwise, I'm just, talking about. So I'm not always aware that there's actually a camera filming me. So I guess, so during an interview or just even sort of other tasks, people most of the time tend to forget that there's a recording apparatus running, I guess. You still have to do all the consent and information first. So if you want to do whatever type of recording you want to do, you have to clarify this first before you start your procedure. And so you have to get consent that that's all right. If it's done with another additional person or with video or with audio, you always have to get the consent. But it can be certainly a good idea to have an additional person, especially in the beginning when you're not that confident with running the interview and gathering data at the same time and taking notes. It certainly can be a good idea to have an additional person there. Probably can be challenging to find this additional person that was willing to sit with you sort of through 21-hour sessions, gathering this data. But if you can find somebody, that's certainly a good idea to look into that. And what can be challenging, so if you say don't do so at the expense of listening, it can be challenging to try to scribble and keep track or to note down observations and still listen to what's going on in the conversation. So that's, again, where an additional person probably could come in handy, who does observations, and you still can keep full attention to your conversation partner. Important, sort of the last point there, summarize your notes as soon as possible. Because especially, you can appreciate, a phone call or whatever, you scribble down stuff. Right after the phone call, you probably still know what you scribbled down there. If it's a phone number, a time, whatever, then you still probably know, okay, that was the time we're going to meet, or this is the phone number of X and X person or whatever. The next day, when you see your scribbled notes, you might think huh? What was that? There's a number there. Is it a phone number? Is it a time? Is it my PIN code or whatever? So it can be. It's so and sometimes you forget. Often you forget to do this right away because you're exhausted or you just have to do other stuff. But just make it a priority. To summarize your data and your notes and your scribbles as soon as possible, and try to bring them in a form that's understandable to you afterwards then as well. So it's very important, often forgotten, but just try to keep this in mind. Try to do this as soon as possible. And I find myself quite often.
I have here. I wrote down a number, but I have no idea. It looks like fun.
Maybe it was a beautiful girl.
Yeah. And if it was a potential date, you might regret it at some stage.
Then I probably would have.
I was thinking, what's the name of this room with a mirror that allow hidden the researchers and you have the participants?
These setups are quite often used in usability labs. So there's one view? One-way mirrors, those with silver, whatever, those one-way mirrors.
But have a special name, no? The name of a researcher who invented the procedure.
I wouldn't be aware that there's a special name, but there's probably one. I wouldn't know it, but it's normally it's sort of those one-way mirrors, and they are, in especially usability labs, they're quite popular to have a team of observers in a separate room, or even all of the observers in a separate room, and the person doing the task in the other room, sort of that they are.
We have one of these rooms here.
No, we don't. We don't have.
Because of TV, everyone's going to
Probably. Well, if they're in a lab sitting, they might be quite suspicious. If it's sort of a big mirror somewhere on the wall, it might look very suspicious.
But you could do the same using cameras, I guess.
Sure.
Right?
Definitely. Yeah. So I know sort of there's a usability lab, or used to be a usability lab in town that had one of those setups, sort of those room setups with a one-way mirror. Here at uni, I don't think there is one, but there is a early childhood education facility, for example, and they have several cameras in a room where they observe children, playing, for example, and do studies. They're hidden, yeah. And this is sort of a setup for observing and doing research with sort of early childhood education with children. Well, recordings really depends on how you record your data. Transcription of data can take very, very, very long time, and it certainly takes longer than the actual recording itself. So if you have 1 hour of recording, depends on audio recording. Just imagine, you do an audio transcript of an recording. You have to type what has been talked about. Probably didn't get something, you have to rewind. You're not as fast as typing, so you have to rewind again. You have to go to the next one, rewind. You didn't get that one, you have to rewind. So it takes a... Well, however you do it, you certainly will sit there longer than the recording itself. If you do video, it probably will take even longer than audio, because you have an additional channel as well that might gives you other types of information that you want to code, for example. So video recording might seem the obvious thing to do, but just keep in mind or consider what you want to do with the video recording afterwards. If you really want to do a full transcript of it with additional coding of gestures, for example, whatever, it can take a very long time. And ideally what you have, it's not just you going to do sort of coding, for example, but you have an additional, at least one or two other persons doing this as well, and then get some sense of inter-rater reliability. So time for doing even just the transcription, not the analysis yet, can multiply and blow up quite easily. So always keep that in mind when you plan those types of studies. And just in general, be consistent. If you do those types of analyses, even during the interview, be as consistent as possible. So how do you, once you switched off, for example, the recording equipment, and there's still some interesting comments, be consistent how to deal with it. If you still want to consider this as part of your data analysis, you can include it, but then you have to include it for everybody and not cherry pick. This was interesting, so I'll just take this as additional piece of information. That wasn't that interesting. Or actually, I don't like this comment, so I'm not going to use it. So you have to be just as consistent as possible. And, respect privacy and anonymity. As we said, every time when you do recording, whatever type of recording it is, you have to clarify this before you start doing it and get consent for that. You have to make sure that it's all right with the person.
In some cases, it might be necessary that people don't feel observed. I did a research with Crystal about comparison, and it's really important that they don't feel embarrassed for any other reasons than what you're testing for.
Yeah. So in this case, you certainly have to go through ethics. Well, I think sort of from did you do this back in the Netherlands? Yeah. In the Netherlands, you probably don't have an ethics process.
No, they have ethics in general.
I'm not sure.
Well, in some countries you don't have ethics committees.
We have the ethics committee
It's
added to you, but
it's a
I'm not
general
sure.
country.
In this case, it can get more tricky. You want to basically save your behind, somehow to if you want to do this, just get.
Yeah,
And what you said.
for consent afterwards.
But yeah, and you have to certainly what you have to do. You have to do debriefing afterwards, where you clarify what happened. What happened there. If there was a deception, you have to clarify. That you used deception because it was necessary for the protocol. You have to clarify what it was you did, and then get the consent in that way. And if if participants say like, I'm really not happy with that, you most likely have can't include this data in your analysis. If they request, that they delete their video, for example, you just have to do it. So in those cases, it's very important to do a debriefing afterwards and to clarify those things. Afterwards, and ideally, you went through ethics clearance first, because if then people afterwards get like, oh no, I didn't know that, and so now I'm just going to to make a big fuss about it, and then just go to your managers and whatever, and then when you have ethics clearance, it sort of can save your behind. It's like, okay, at least we went through all the channels and we got ethics clearance, and so if something goes wrong, you at least have some backing. So during the interview, try to be sort of as friendly, respectful, and non-judgmental as possible. And what you also want to try to build rapport, with your conversation partner. You just want to create a comfortable situation for both parties, because then that's more likely that you will get quality information during the interview. And if it's a really uncomfortable situation, that's your interview doesn't trust you really, they are not going to be talkative. They are not going to, most likely not going to give you quality information. So you want to try to create a comfortable situation for all people involved. Don't bias through your body language. So that's what you mentioned earlier. That can be quite difficult to manage as well. You have to be aware of your what you do in your body language, and that's certainly a skill you have to practice to some extent. Before you start, you can briefly outline your research goals. Really depends again, if you can do it, if that's part of your, if you can't do it as part of your research, you probably should save this for afterwards. Otherwise, you introduce your research goals, why it's why they're here, why it's important to have this interview, what you're going to talk about, complete all the paperwork, inform consent, especially also if you want to do recording, and you can think about sort of having simple questions first, or even just some opening questions to lighten up the mood. One student just the other lately did a study where they used pictures as a method for starting off the interview. What do you see in this picture? Can you explain it to me? Blah blah blah. It's one method of just trying to start a conversation, or just trying to create basically a comfortable situation. And probably have this slide, and then we can have a coffee break. Be flexible if your structure allows you to be flexible. So it depends on if you do a fully structured interview, you can't be less flexible. But if your setup allows you to do so, be flexible. At the same time, try to keep things on track. This can be quite a difficult balance to strike. Avoid jargon. If it's important to you to use jargon or certain terms, you have to define them and make it clear that they're understood. If you're not really clear about an answer, try to clarify as soon as possible. Because otherwise, you probably, if you can't make sense out of an answer, it's of not that much value to you anyway. So if you don't understand an answer, well, you might as well not have asked it in the first place. So try to clarify right away if you're not sure what something what something means, and try rather to listen than to talk. So should we have a break? You can switch on the other camera as well. Is this running all the time? Okay. Well, we scratched this earlier a little bit. Sort of, is your interview really telling you what, what they actually believe or what they think you wanna hear? And it's quite apparent often with kids, for example. You ask them, "Oh, did you like it?" The other day we've been showing the kids the coloring. It was last week, the coloring book, and then we asked them, "Did you like the coloring book?" And everybody said yes. So the question is, did you really like it, or just think, "Oh, those guys came here," so you have to be polite and say yes. Well, you don't. You can't make sure. You can try to read between the lines as much as possible. It's like, okay, well, they really hesitated with this answer, so might not be too sure about if that's really a true representation of what they believe, or if it's just socially acceptable, or what they believe is sort of the answer should be. So if you have any doubts, make a note and try to consider this in your interpretation of the results. So we talked about interviews. So let's talk a little bit about focus groups. So interview. Oh?
Yeah.
It's so cool. So it should be here. Interesting. So as we said, well, interviews are one person at a time, apparently. So if you have, for example, 1 hour, as we said, 1 hour of interview, we have several hours of analyzing your observations, your notes, your recordings. With focus groups, similar setup to some extent, but it's actually more people. So the size of focus groups, there's a lot of discussion about it. Sort of what's the ideal size of a focus group? Normally they're around 8 to 12, probably even less sometimes. If it's more than 12, it's going to be very challenging to manage those focus groups. So you want to probably err on sort of the lower side, so not to that many people at once.
There are some software which could help you to analyze the videos. For example, taking notes.
There is software. I'm not an expert in using those software. There's for example, in Vivo and those types of content analysis softwares. But yeah, I'm not an expert in those. This type of analysis and this type of software, but there is software out there.
And what's the name of this kind of software? Video analysis software or something like that?
Well, it really depends on what you're after. So there's certain type of software that makes it easier for you to do coding. For example, where you have a screen, sort of a video, mm-hmm. and a timeline, for example, and then you can do coding. You just go through the video and can do sort of either loops or just go through and rewind, and then on the timeline make notes of sort of, for example, observations. These are quite common. There's several out there. So this, I would say, sort of video coding, video observation software. I'm not sure what's the correct term for it, but there's various providers out there that sort of offer this type of software. We even have a small tool. Julian at the lab developed sort of a small web-based tool that allows you to do some simple video analysis like that. So this is sort of for coding, where you still have to do sort of manual coding. There's also other software that sort of tries, for text, for example, tries to extract some data automatically from text, but I haven't used that yet, so I can't really comment.
You mean data as timings and movements, or that what kind of extraction? No.
Yeah, well, again, I'm not an expert in that, so I haven't used it. But they try to from what I believe, try to extract data from text, like words and
okay.
So there's different types of software that can be used for this type of content or video analysis. Well, if we look at focus groups, sort of what are sort of advantages and disadvantages of conducting focus groups? Well, as you have more people, you get more different insights you get insights from all kinds of different. Well, it depends on how you select your participants. You just get different angles on a topic and different viewpoints to a topic. There's most likely at least one person that's sort of just very talkative and will hopefully stimulate the discussions. Disadvantage, on the other hand, it sometimes can be quite difficult. If it's a quiet group to get discussions started at all. Some people can feel intimidated by sitting in a group setting. They probably would prefer to sit with you one-on-one. They don't feel comfortable talking about their opinions within a group. They might feel embarrassed or whatever. Talking about their opinions. So it can be difficult as well. So you have to manage group dynamics. If some participants talk all the time, others don't talk, you somehow have tried to manage to include everybody into the discussion and manage the people who talk a lot or probably too much. So that can be quite difficult to do this in a non-rude manner sometimes. You certainly have to have more structure. Yes, or you have to have some structure at least, to keep it managed. But you can't normally use a fully structured interview because, you somehow have to strike a balance there. So you can try to talk about certain topic areas, but it's less suited for a fully structured interview where you just ask everybody about their opinion about one certain question, because then you might as well do an interview rather than, because what's ideally happening in a focus group that through the discussion you basically get a different type of information. People can bounce off ideas of each other or learn basically from other responses. You most likely can't ask that many questions because it takes longer. Everybody, more people are going to answer your questions, so you can't have as many questions normally as in an interview. And the selecting participants for your focus group can sometimes be challenging. So, is it more important for your research question, or is it better, or do you believe it's better to have a diverse group with different backgrounds, different opinions? This can potentially create more discussion, or is it better to have a more homogeneous group, like experts, so to get sort of a really in-depth understanding of a certain topic area? So that's something you have to decide, and can greatly influence the outcomes of a focus group, as you can appreciate. If you have a very homogeneous group, you probably get more in-depth, less broad answers, but with a very a group of some people from different backgrounds, you get just different kinds of insights. Be prepared to deal with digressions. So if it's with more people involved, it's more likely that people get into tangents and just digress from the topic and bounce ideas off each other and then just start discussing something completely different. So you have to try to bring, basically, if that happens, try to bring the attention back to the topic at hand. If some participants start to argue, it's your job as sort of the focus group manager to try to resolve arguments between participants. And as sort of we discussed earlier, with focus groups it can be, it's probably a good idea to have not just one experimenter in there, but multiple people, at least two. One who manages the group and the group dynamics, and another experimenter who manages or who looks after sort of the content, probably. Who just makes notes and tries to sort of to get a better idea sort of about what has been, sort of what's the content, and taking notes. And the other person tries just to manage the group and keep the discussion on track. So that can be a good, especially for focus groups, can be a good idea to have multiple experimenters. Try to give everybody a chance to talk. So you don't want to exclude certain people who are not really that talk that much, or who might feel intimidated in the group setting. So you can directly address a person. So Martin, what did you think about it? Could you please comment on that issue? So you can try to directly address a person to try to involve those people in as well in the discussion. Well, if some people just don't talk, sometimes you can try to make an effort, rephrase the question, dig deeper, give some context. Okay, so for example, how would you use it at home? Can you explain that, for example? Sometimes even then that doesn't help. Sometimes you probably get people not to talk at all. So just make your best effort to include everybody to get some answers out of them. But if they just don't, they don't. You have to sort of appreciate that as well. As we discussed with the interviews, you can use props or probes to stimulate feedback, to demonstrate basically if you're talking about sort of a new topic or a new sort of an issue that's, or your new, robotic interface, whatever that might be, people won't know what you're talking about. So it can be quite good to start off with a demonstration, whatever, to stimulate discussion. So debriefing, as we said, that's important for interviews and focus groups alike. So debriefing is always important with those types of evaluations. So you can ask for sort of final comments, for sort of you try to summarize the results. So today we've talked about these topics. So these were sort of the main answers, the main opinions. So do you agree with that? Sort of, if you could summarize the results, is that, would you agree with those results as well? Do you have any more comments? You can try to integrate what you found in the focus group into the body of research, related research. Like, okay, well, this is, goes in line with findings from, this and that researcher, for example. Well, obviously say thanks. People come spend their time for participating in your research. So it's your turn to sort of say thanks for coming here, for participating. And again, summarize your results and notes immediately. So otherwise, you just might forget what happened. Some interesting bits and pieces from the interviews. If written results, again, do this as quickly as possible. But even if sort of something you didn't note down, but just have still in your mind, which was important or interesting, note that down as quickly as possible, because you will forget it rather quickly otherwise. You also can think about telephone or online interviewing. That's a way of conducting those interviews as well. And well, it can be telephone, web chat, email, conference calls, whatever. You know, you can do it in person or mediated through technology. Can be done synchronous or asynchronous. And there's, well, advantages, disadvantages to both approaches, I guess. Well, if it's per email, it's certainly going to be a different dynamic than when it's done through, well, by telephone. And you just have to be aware of, you know, what potential influences could sort of the technology delivery method have on the results. If you do it by email, for example, people have a lot more time to think about an answer. About sort of what you ask them. It can be an advantage or a disadvantage. You know, sometimes it can be an advantage because they really have sort of time to have sort of in-depth sort of, or just really can think about it. Okay, what does it really mean, or how do I feel about it? On the other hand, it can be sort of a disadvantage as well, potentially, because they start to rationalize or just try to sort of come up with all crazy stories, for example. It could go either way. Just be aware of that. If you do it by email or asynchronous, it could be that other people influence. So, I send you a question, interview question at home. You get the email, then you can discuss with your friends or with your partner. Oh, what do you think about that? That could then influence your result to the question. So, again, you just have to be aware of those pros and cons when you plan such a study. So. Well, pros, it can be easier. It can be cheaper to do it that way. You can reach potentially more people, different people who you probably would have a hard time getting into to the lab, for example. On the cons side, well, there's a lack of face-to-face contact, so you don't get an idea about body language. And all those types of things. They're just lacking from this type of, even if you do it via Skype, you just get a different type of conversation. So you can't, you don't get such a good appreciation of the body language. Even have sort of, just missing certain cues with video conferencing, for example, as well. So let's talk a little bit about data analysis. So again, it's more or less a quick overview of how to analyze qualitative data gathered through sort of interviews and focus groups. And again, if you want to have a more in-depth understanding, you can get an introductory chapter in the book, and they suggest further reading then as well. So again, do the data analysis as soon as possible. It's still fresh in your mind, and sort of you still have all kinds of different impressions and sort of knowledge about sort of your scribbles, for example. It's still fresh in your memory. If you have open-ended questions, you have to decide: do you want to transcribe the audio? So do you want to have a written transcription of the audio, which could help you afterwards for analyzing the data, or if you have other experiments to analyze the data then as well, that can help quite a lot. Or you can even try, if you sort of try to use some tools to do some automated data analysis using the transcription. But again, this whole, just be aware that it just takes considerable time and effort to analyze this type of data. And it's always like with every type of evaluation, decide on the analysis method before you conduct the interview, because that helps you to get sort of a good understanding what does it take to get results out of it, and not be surprised afterwards. Once you have all the data, so what do I do with it, and then just be overwhelmed with what you have. So always try to decide before you start anything, how you're going to gather data, how you're going to analyze the data, and is it manageable? What resources do I need in order to get valuable insights out of my study? So for qualitative analysis, the main idea is to find common structures and themes in your data. So that means you want to try to find important ideas that just come up repeatedly during the interview or during the focus group. So with a content analysis, for example, you can, on the one hand, for example, try to count frequencies, terms, like this, or frequencies of gestures, for example, those types of things. And quite important is categorization as well. So what do you want to probably do? You want to identify important topics, then categorize them, then just try to see what kind of categories emerge from the data, for example.
But I have some ideas that come into my mind. For example, in industrial design, it's really usual that people design some crazy objects and do some unstructured interview about the evaluation of these objects or interfaces and stuff. And it's totally acceptable, no matter if they do in the way that you are presenting the technique or not. No matter, all people say, it's really qualitative and it's okay, the evaluation, the experience of the user is all the times in this way qualitative. But on the other hand, in my background in engineering, usually people is not really open to consider these kind of techniques totally valid. They say, it's really subjective, and you.
Well, it certainly depends on the field you're in, and approaches change over time as well. And what sort of seems to be acceptable at some stage, might not be acceptable in later years. So, for example, in HCI, HCI traditionally had a strong hold in quantitative user studies. It was mainly in sort of 80s, the 90s, but sort of it seemed to change a little bit over the years as well to that qualitative approaches and ethnography, for example, became more established and more recognized. So I think on the one hand, it certainly depends on the field you're in. And the more you're in engineering, probably the more quantitative approaches you will use. And in design, quantitative approaches probably don't make that much sense. There, you probably will find more qualitative approaches. From my point of view, again, it's not, one approach is not better than the other, because it really depends on the question. If you have a completely new design and you want to get people's perceptions on it, you probably find a better answer with that if you do a qualitative, unstructured interview. I think there's no correct answer to that. So from my point of view, again, these are all tools in your toolbox, and you just have to find the right tool for answering for answering your questions.
My question is, how do you present the results, especially for unexpected phenomena, to combine to the people about it? Because I think you have really a deep understanding of the phenomena using this kind of techniques. Because of course you spend a lot of time focused in get information and data analysis. And if people from other fields is closer to accept these things, how do you present the results in the way that these people say, okay, it's qualitative analysis, but it's important?
Well, I think it's just, you just have to make the case. What is it exactly you want to get across to the reader? If you tell a story with your paper, and if you say, like, okay, for us, it's really important to get a better understanding how people, because it's a new artifact, a new artistic artifact or whatever. And at this stage, there haven't been that many studies yet looking into that, or no studies at all. So we're at quite an early stage, for example. And so at this stage, it's important to get a better understanding of the how and why. So that's why we use a qualitative approach, and that's why we present our data like that. This could be. I think it really depends on telling the reader why you chose your approach, and why it's the best approach possible to find an answer to this specific question you have. I think it's mainly your job to convince the reader that sort of you did it a certain way because it was the best way possible. I think sort of in the end, and you always will find, well, you always will run the risk that, you know, it's not an acceptable approach, you know, or some reviewers won't find it acceptable. But that's, you know, that's part of the research game as well. You know, you can't always please everybody. You know, there's people with different opinions, and at some stage probably we'll have different opinions. And yeah, as you sort of said as well, some research fields have just stronger opinions about certain evaluation approaches than others, and it will probably be more challenging to get a qualitative study in a pure engineering journal, for example. That's certainly going to be more difficult. But again, from my point of view, it's a matter of making a good point why you did it exactly that way, and why it's important to do it that way, and why it's the best way of finding a quality answer to the research question you have at hand. And I think, well, that's sort of is the best answer I can give you to that to some extent.
By the way,
and just to make sure, the qualitative analysis, you know, if you do it correct, and you know, it's not just, you know, that you throw something to a person, so like, you know, do something with it, and then you just loosely write down, okay, this person just picked up the, you know, my new cup and really liked it. You know, that's not a qualitative analysis. You know, we're going to, in the next slides, give you a quick overview of, you know, certain steps you can take, for example, to sort of make sure that you get good data out of, you know, interviews and observational data. So multiple analyses, again, this means multiple analysis by multiple researchers, and as well what I sort of probably sort of included, again, triangulation of data sources. You know, the more research is looking at sort of a certain phenomena can increase sort of the reliability and validity of your data. So let's have a quick look at sort of content analysis. So the content analysis is sort of a systematic and replicable technique for compressing data. Because what do you want to do with this, you know, just in general with qualitative analysis, you want to not necessarily generalize, but you want to compress the complexity, because, you know, you have, you know, 1 hour's worth of observation. So you could write about everything you found in your observations about every person. There would probably be a 500-page monologue about sort of what, you know, sort of the transcript. What do you actually want to do? You want to categorize, basically. So you want to make sense of what you found. You know? So you want to compress the data into sort of a meaningful format that you can convey to, okay, we found that this emerged from the data. So we found that overall, you know, people, you know, try to grab the cup on the handle and not from that side. For example, you know, so you just want to try to make sense of the data and just, you know, compress as much as possible to make it more manageable, and talking about your findings. So for analyzing text data, for example, you can approach it in 2 different ways. So you can have coding categories. So you can start off with a certain coding categories in the first place, either derived by theoretical frameworks, by previous research. So these are the categories that are important. So you can try to find, you know, does my data fit into those categories? And then you can try to check, you know, if that's sort of the case with your observations as well. The other approach would be emergent coding. So that tries to find a sort of categorization scheme or coding scheme from the data. So this goes through multiple iterations and steps. So coders, you know, first go through sort of a sample, a subset of data, try to find, okay, these are important topics that emerge from the data. These are potential coding categories. Then they basically consolidate the list, together and try to find sort of iterative through an iterative approach to derive a coding scheme and then code the data accordingly. And again, you have reliability checks, intercoder reliability, for example, and those type of things. So you have to make sure that you have quality checks along the way as much as possible. So for example, what you can do while coding text, you can look for key items, and just some examples. So you can look for sort of certain statements like objectives, actions, outcomes, consequences, causes, strategies, and these are just examples for those, where you can find sort of potential actions that that emerge from or that occur while using the interface is, for example, entering passwords or just entering online chats, for example, in a web application. So these are, for example, statements or categories or sort of coding items to look out for. So to ensure quality of your data analysis, what do you want to do? You want to have those reliability checks. Well, there's intra and intercoder reliability. Intracoder reliability would be your own stability to some extent. So how stable can you categorize certain data to some extent? So the exam is whether the same coder rates the data the same way throughout the coding process. So if you're consistent within your coding of the data, and the intercoder reliability looks whether different coders come to the same or similar conclusions. If they derive, for example, the same. If Martin and Eduardo do the coding, no, just you can check how well do the results match, for example, and then there's certain things you can calculate measures for intercoder reliability. And then you get a number out of it. For example, it's 0.7 and 0.8, and I think sort of from there's guidelines, and if it's better than 0.7 or 0.8, it's considered as good enough match between the coding that has taken place between two coders.
Of course, it's I remember some of the first classes in this course. Reproducibility in physics, for example, is more exact. I mean, the experiments are you use the same techniques and in the same phenomena, and you obtain similar results. But in this case, you say different coders code the same data.
Well,
you can expect.
It's sort of the same idea. You compare measurements. So in physics, whatever, you compare more likely, more exact measurements with each other. So you expect a lot less variation between the measurements. And with subjective codings, you certainly expect a lot more variation.
And it's acceptable.
The measurements. It's acceptable to some extent, but there's still sort of guidelines, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And if it's below a certain threshold, those reliability measures, you just have to see, so why is it sort of, why don't the measurements match, for example, and then you potentially have to go through another cycle of coding and see if you can increase the reliability through sort of either getting other coders or going through another coding cycle, or probably just clarifying the coding scheme or categories between between the coders. It could be, for example, that you understood one category or one coding category different from Martin. Then it would be just a case of clarifying what does it actually mean, which types of words or behaviors or whatever do we put into a certain category. And if that's then clarified, you might then derive at a better match between your results. For reporting the results, try to be as clear and concise as possible. There is certainly differences in reporting results from quantitative and from qualitative data. So, still, I guess my recommendation would be, try to be as clear as possible. If you report numbers instead of most, it comes to like 7 out of 10. It's always a good idea to use quotes from respondents. Instead of you sort of reproducing what participants said, it's for important bits and pieces, with important quotes, or it can be a good idea to include those direct quotes in your discussion or in your results section. Use sort of still don't try to identify your participants, but that's quite obvious, I guess, as well. And that was more or less it. So if you want to have more in-depth, just have a first look at the book, and there's some more further literature in there as well. So that was actually our lecture series. If you have any concerns, questions, please stop by my office. I will leave this Friday for a month. So if you have any burning questions, try to see me before Friday. Fun, yeah. Well, going to Europe, different places, work, and a little bit of annual leave as well. So yeah, fun and exciting.
Awesome.
So I'll certainly have a look at the assignments over the next weeks. I can't promise to probably won't have time. Well, most likely won't have time this week because there's stuff to sort of prepare. And there's a new assignment. So the last assignment for sort of this week is to design a interview. Again, about the topic is either you can choose a topic that you find exciting or suitable, or so there's an example there as well. So you can choose basically the topic. Again, just try to make as clear as possible what the topic is, that I sort of get an understanding what you talk about. And so the idea is to design an interview and then actually conduct the interview with at least one person and summarize your findings and your experiences. So it's what you find out about the topic. So just quickly summarize the findings. And also there's some questions for you to answer. So what you learn from designing and conducting the interview. Just some quick words about that. And then some considerations about sort of, then you are asked to sort of discuss what you would change if it was a focus group. So you don't have to conduct a focus group, but just discuss how you would change the question if you were to do the same topic or inquire the same topic in a focus group rather than an interview. So it hopefully should be clear from the description on the learn environment. Otherwise, just drop me an email. Thank you.